Hi, I'm Dr. Blunt, academic, philosopher, plumber of the depths of human evil. Today, I want to look at the question, is global poverty a crime against humanity? Spoilers, it is, but it's the journey to that conclusion that matters, not just the destination. However, this is a really big question. In order to answer it properly, there's going to be two videos. In this one, we're going to deal with what I like to call the Chapeau Puzzle. Chapeau means hat. It's a hat joke. And yes, I own this unironically. So let's talk about crimes against humanity. This is a term you're probably familiar with. We hear it on the news, we read it on the internet, but a lot of people don't know what its history is and what it actually means. So much like genocide, crimes against humanity emerge as a category, a clear category, in the aftermath of the Second World War. Hersch Lauderpacht was the main theorist behind developing the idea, and his drive was to bring international law up to speed with the atrocities committed by the Nazis and the Japanese during the Second World War. And we needed a new category to do that. The best summary that I can think of why we needed crimes against humanity as a category comes from Robert Jackson at the Nuremberg trials. The refuge of the defendants can only be their hope that international law will lag so far behind the moral sense of mankind that conduct which is crime in the moral sense must be regarded as innocent in law. Civilization asks whether law is so laggard as to be utterly helpless to deal with crimes of this magnitude by criminals of this order of importance. It does not expect that you can make war impossible. It does expect that your juridical actions will put the forces of international law, its precepts, its prohibitions, and most of all its sanctions on the side of peace, so that men and women of goodwill in all countries may have leave to live by no man's leave underneath the law. Since the Second World War, the idea of a crime against humanity has solidified in international law through things like the ad hoc tribunals for Cambodia, the former Yugoslavia, and Rwanda, through to the creation of the International Criminal Court. There's a pretty strong body of thought around what constitutes a crime against humanity, which is very useful for us because philosophers haven't done a great job. Now, legal philosophers, there's a pretty good niche about examining crimes against humanity, but ethics and political philosophy are really lagging behind, which is why it's great that we have the chapeau elements to deal with. All right, in law, chapeaus are super helpful. They're the beginning of a treaty or legislation in which key terms are defined. We're given individually necessary conditions that are jointly sufficient for key ideas. When talking about crimes against humanity, we have 5 of these conditions. There is an attack. The relevant acts are part of the attack must be widespread or systemic. The attacks must be directed against a civilian population. There must be knowledge of the attack. So what I'm going to do with the rest of this video is look at whether any of these 5 conditions would exclude global poverty as a crime against humanity. The first condition is that there has to be an attack. Now you might be thinking, well, that doesn't sound like poverty to me. When I think of an attack, I think of interpersonal violence, like street crime or perhaps warfare. This is not the reality of poverty. And you'd be right. So, video over. Go home. Go watch something else. Bye.
I love you.
No, I'm kidding. Come back. Come back. Don't go anywhere. When we're talking about an attack in the context of crimes against humanity, we're not talking about violence necessarily. Our concept of a crime against humanity was shaped deeply by the Akayesu judgment from the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. They ruled that an attack can be non-violent insofar as it could be, say, the imposition of apartheid, or it could be the creation of social tension so as to produce inter-ethnic violence. Now, these attacks are in themselves not necessarily violent. So therefore, when we think about global poverty, we could perhaps consider it an attack if it meets other conditions, but there's no reason to exclude it at this moment. But an attack is bigger, right? The second necessary condition addresses the various acts that form part of the attack. There's a strong argument that an attack may not have to be violent, but that the acts that compose the attack might have to be. I associate this argument closely with David Lubin. who basically argued that if we move towards a nonviolent interpretation of acts and attacks, then we're going to have an over-capacious understanding of what a crime against humanity is. He argues that if crimes against humanity include something like a stable system of oppression, then they might expand to include things like, I don't know, the oppression of women that has been sort of characteristic of most human societies basically since the beginning of time. And he calls this a step towards permanent misanthropy. My response to Lubin can basically be condensed into a meme. If you are willing to arbitrarily exclude injustices that disproportionately affect women or working class people or people of color because it makes the status quo a bit, well, obviously unjust, well, you're not giving me an argument. This is just a status quo bias position, and I don't got no time for it. Moreover, this isn't even true in practice. One of the least controversial crimes against humanity is slavery. And slavery is ultimately a stable system of oppression. Now, when you think about slavery, you probably associate it with torture, exploitation, rape, murder. It was terrible. There were numerous evils produced by slavery, but we need to take a step back and remember that slavery could potentially be benign. So let's say you got bought by someone, but your owner happens to be either really nice or really lazy, never interferes with you, never tells you what to do. You get to do whatever you want. You might actually have a better lifestyle than a free person. Now, would this be an acceptable condition? Well, obviously not, because the ownership of another person gives the slave owner, the power to do all of those terrible things. It is simply the power to commit those acts of violence that is problematic about slavery, not the violence itself. If it was simply violence, then we would have a language to describe this. Slavery would be problematic because of murder. It would be problematic because of rape. But it's more than that. It is the license given to do that, legitimacy, that makes slavery so reprehensible. So unless Lubin's going to walk back slavery as a crime against humanity, I just don't see how his argument stands. Now, there's one last thing I want to talk about, and that is the agents involved with these acts and attacks. Now, oftentimes people will say it has to be an agent of the state. Richard Vernon makes this case in What is a Crime Against Humanity? Because he believes in the inversion thesis, that crime against humanity turns the state from a protector into a predator, that he thinks that it has to be the agents of the state who commit the crime. But I am a little bit more liberal. I think it only has to be someone who is engaged in an organization that has the capacity to plan out an attack. And we see this in the prosecution of members of subnational terrorist groups like the Lord's Resistance Army. So we can say there's no reason to exclude global poverty from this. So if it is produced by supranational institutions that produce a stable system of oppression, then there is no reason to exclude. We can't get rid of it on the basis of an attack, of an act, or of an agent. The third condition is that crimes against humanity either have to be widespread or systemic. Widespread refers to the magnitude of a crime. How many victims does it produce, for example? Whereas systemic identifies the organizational element of a crime against humanity, that it is the product of planning, that it is the product of institutions bringing their resources to bear to perpetrate the attack. This is useful because it helps us disaggregate crimes against humanity from uncontrolled or random acts of violence. There might be serious random acts of violence in a riot, for example, or something smaller and more tragic like a murder. But these are distinct from a crime against humanity. They fall into a category we might call ordinary crimes. Crimes against humanity are extraordinary because of the level of planning and because of their level of magnitude. So does this give us a reason to exclude global poverty? Well, the answer has to be no. Even when we take into account some of the worst crimes against humanity, such as the killing fields of Cambodia or the Holocaust, these are very small numbers of people compared to the number of people living in severe poverty. By a very generous estimation, probably about 600 million people are living in poverty today. If it is a crime against humanity, it basically dwarfs all the other crimes against humanity. Is it systemic? Well, if you believe the cosmopolitan thesis that underpins this video series, then yes, it is the product of institutional designs of the global economy developed in places like the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, developed in Washington and London and Paris and Beijing, that produce a certain arrangement of institutions that are not inevitable. They are designed by choice. They are systemic. So we can't exclude global poverty on this basis. So let's go to the next one. The fourth condition is super simple. The attack has to be against civilians. The overwhelming number of people living in severe poverty are living in severe poverty as civilians. The only reason this categorization exists is to delineate war crimes from crimes against humanity. So, is global poverty excluded? No, it's not. The fifth element of a crime against humanity is knowledge of the attack. It goes to the mens rea, the mental element of a crime. Now, in the last video, I argued that genocide and global poverty were incomparable because genocide requires a deliberate intent to kill a group of people, whereas global poverty is not the product of the same sort of social institutions. So does this exclude global poverty from being a crime against humanity? The answer is no. And that's because there is a different type of mens rea at play. Mark Drummel identifies 3 different categories of people who can be involved in a crime against humanity: policymakers, mid-level operatives, and low-key enforcers. We are interested in the policymakers because even though their hands aren't literally dripping with blood, they are the moral authors of the crime because they're the ones who envisage it. They're the ones who bring the organization to bear on it. They are the ones who see it completed to fruition, even if they are far away from the site of the crime. Think about it this way. Stalin didn't get in a car and drive up to Siberia to torture and murder people personally, but he designed the policy that sent millions of Soviet citizens during the Great Purge to the Gulag to meet a terrible fate. That makes him responsible. People in these positions are held to a standard of accountability and foreseeability that excludes direct intention. All they need to do is have a plan, implement it, and be responsible for foreseeable outcomes. If they could have foreseen that they would have killed millions of people, then they are responsible for it. There is a level of reasonableness and foreseeability that attaches to them. In the context of global poverty, we've seen this argument be made by Diane Kearney regarding famine and food deprivation as a violation of socioeconomic rights that is also prosecutable. In looking at judgments from Cambodia and from Yugoslavia, she notes that the standard for the mental element is often foreseeability. Could you have reasonably foreseen that, for example, sending a bunch of people to the killing fields in Cambodia, where they didn't have sufficient shelter or food or medical treatment, would result in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people? The answer is yes. Therefore, people like Pol Pot are guilty of crimes against humanity because they had that responsibility, even if they didn't intend, and that's a generous reading of what Pol Pot did, people to die. You have to be able to foresee reasonable outcomes. If I get in my car and I'm drunk and I crash into someone and kill them, I am responsible, even if I was not really compos mentis because I was drunk, because I could have foreseen that getting behind the wheel of the car while intoxicated could produce this sort of outcome. The type of intentionality at play while considering if global poverty is a crime against humanity is whether the current organization of the global economy produces a level of poverty and all the associated ills that otherwise could have been avoided if reasonable actions were taken. Now, on that standard, there is no reason to exclude global poverty from being a crime against humanity. By looking at the chapeau elements of crimes against humanity, we can say that there is no reason to exclude global poverty. It's the product of an attack, which is not necessarily violent, it's just a stable system of oppression, and the various acts prop up this system of oppression. It is widespread, affecting hundreds of millions, if not billions, of human beings alive today. It is systemic insofar it is the deliberate outcome of organizational policy. It affects civilians. And finally, the mental element is there. It doesn't require us to want to kill people or harm people. It doesn't require malevolence. All it requires is negligence and recklessness. We know that our current organization of the global economy produces millions of surplus deaths a year. It reduces people to living in inhumane circumstances in tens of millions of people's lives. We could change this quite easily. We could redistribute wealth more effectively. We could have a fairer economic system. We choose not to do this. It is foreseeable. It is avoidable. Seems to make it criminal. But I'm not quite ready to make that claim. All that I've done in this video is to show why global poverty can't be excluded. But if you look at the Rome Statute and you go through the list of things that count as a crime against humanity, you're not going to find global poverty. But you are going to find a category that says inhumane actions like the other ones. The next video, we're going to see whether there are comparisons between specific crimes against humanity and global poverty. Thanks for watching. Take care, everyone. Oof, such a drag of a topic, my God.